Thanks for coming to this talk. I'm going to talk a bit about some of our recent work on social risk-taking in adolescence. So I became really interested in adolescent development about 20 years ago. I had done a PhD and postdoc on schizophrenia, and I became interested in the fact that schizophrenia normally has its onset at some point in late adolescence or early adulthood. And I started to wonder why this is. What is it about the development of the brain that is different in teenagers who go on to develop schizophrenia compared with teenagers who don't? And at that point, that was in the early 2000s, to my surprise, when I looked through the literature on brain development in humans, I found there was very, very little known about how the typically developing brain changes during the human adolescence, let alone in human adolescents who develop some kind of mental health problem. So at that point in the early 2000s, I decided to change the focus of my own research and to start to study the development of the typically developing adolescent brain and behavior. As many of you will know, it's not just schizophrenia that has its onset in late adolescence. Many mental health problems start in adolescence. It's been estimated that 75% of mental illnesses first appear before the age of 24, and you can see that in this graph here, which shows the average age range of onset of a variety of different psychological and psychiatric conditions, and most of them onset at some point in adolescence. So adolescence is defined as the period of life between 10 and 24 years. It's a unique period of biological, psychological and social development. Now, when you think of adolescents or teenagers, you probably immediately conjure up kind of stereotypical images of kids who are taking risks, who are hanging out with their friends, who are impulsive. Maybe they're lazy and make bad decisions. There are lots of negative stereotypes that we hold as a society about adolescence, which is an interesting and sort of worrying phenomenon, which I'll come back to throughout this talk. But this is nothing new. These stereotypes that we hold about adolescence have been around for millennia. I'll just show you a couple of quotations, one by Socrates. So over 2,000 years ago, Socrates wrote a lot about youth. And he says things like they have bad manners, contempt for authority, they show disrespect for elders and love chatter in the place of exercise. Aristotle as well wrote a lot about youth, and he has very long passages about describing young people, and he says things like they are passionate, irascible and apt to be carried away by their impulses. This is the age when people are most devoted to their friends. Now that is a phenomenon, the idea that adolescence is when people are most devoted to their friends, that Aristotle noticed over 2,000 years ago, and which this whole talk is really about. Okay, so that across history, we have had very strikingly similar descriptions of adolescence to the way we typically describe adolescence today. Across cultures too. So there is some kind of argument, some people have argued that adolescence, these stereotypes we have about adolescence are very Western, and that adolescence is a Western, particularly an American phenomenon invented about 100 years ago. But actually, when you look at adolescence across cultures, despite the fact that different cultures have very different societal expectations of this age group, you can nevertheless see similarities between the way adolescents behave across cultures. So this is a study carried out a few years ago by Larry Steinberg and his colleagues, where he looked at adolescent typical behaviours across 11 very different cultures around the world. And what he found was some differences which are really interesting, but also what was striking actually is the similarities between the developmental trajectories of adolescent typical behaviour across these different cultures. So I'll just show you a couple of examples. So one example is sensation seeking. Sensation seeking is defined as the desire to experience novelty and to take risks. And he measured this with a composite of questionnaires and experimental risk-taking tasks. And what you can see here is how sensation seeking changes across age. This was a cross-sectional study, by the way, not longitudinal. So this is age-related differences in performance across age. Between the ages of 10 and 30 in the 11 different cultures. The black line in the middle is the average and the dotted lines are the confidence intervals. So across cultures, across all these 11 cultures, sensation seeking increases during the teenage years and it peaks in the late teens. We're talking about risk taking really. And then it declines in the 20s. And in contrast, he also looked at self-regulation. Here he found again very similar patterns of developmental change across cultures where self-regulation, the ability to regulate your behavior, to plan your actions and to inhibit inappropriate behaviors like risk-taking, like dangerous risk-taking, increases gradually across the teenage years until it stabilizes in the 20s. So even across cultures, there are similarities between adolescent typical behaviors. Now, I mentioned risk-taking here. Risk-taking and sensation-seeking are firstly stereotypes that we all hold about adolescents. And it's also something that is very well researched now about adolescent behavior and adolescent development. And I think that's probably because we really worry about the risks that adolescents take. And I will come back to this throughout this talk and later on in the context right now of COVID and risk-taking around social distancing and that kind of thing. We worry about the risks that adolescents take. We worry about things like smoking, experimenting with drugs, binge drinking, dangerous driving, and now even socializing in the context of COVID and the spread of the virus. It's not surprising that we worry about risk-taking. If you look at mortality rates across the lifespan, you find that in Western countries, in high-income countries, the leading cause of mortality in young people aged 10 to 24 years is accidents, mostly resulting from risk-taking. So this is something to worry about because in theory, these are preventable deaths. This is not true at any other age range in development, when at other ages the leading cause of mortality tends to be health related, but actually adolescents are relatively healthy, but they still have mortality resulting from risk taking. So we need to worry about that, and I think that's really the basis of why so many different groups around the world work on risk taking in adolescence. However, risk-taking is much more complex than just this idea that all adolescents take risks. We know they don't. There are some adolescents who are very risk-averse and others who are very risk-taking. There are lots of individual differences in the propensity to take risks in adolescence. Secondly, risk-taking is not always a bad thing. We think about those risks that adolescents take that are dangerous, the ones I just mentioned, but actually we all need to take risks, particularly in our adolescence, when it's really important to go out and explore our environments and to experiment with new things and to eventually become an independent adult. And thirdly, the context of risk-taking is crucial, and particularly in adolescence, it's been found that young people are much more likely to take risks when they're with their friends. Now that makes sense anecdotally if you think about those risks: smoking, taking drugs, binge drinking, dangerous driving. They're risks that adolescents don't tend to take when they're on their own, but when they're with their friends. And there's been a massive amount of research showing that, both in the lab, in experimental studies, and also from epidemiological studies and studies of real life risk-taking. And I'm going to show you one example of that. This is a graph from the American Automobile Foundation. And what it shows is basically, it's a graph of fatal car accidents in drivers under the age of 21 in the USA. What it shows is the percentage increase in the death risk with with passengers compared with no passengers. So no passengers is down here. If a young driver carries one passenger in the car with them, that increases their chance of a fatal accident by about 40%. And then there's an exponential increase in the risk of having a fatal accident with each additional passenger in the car. So there's something about having passengers in the car which increases the tendency of adolescent drivers to take risks and have car accidents. This has been shown, like I said, many times in many different studies, and it's now been taken into account in policy. For example, in Canada and Australia, young people there are limits on the number of passengers young people can take with them in the car. For example, I think in Canada, they're not allowed to take passengers who are not family members for the first 2 years after they've passed their test. And some car insurance companies also offer lower insurance premiums for young drivers as long as they never drive passengers in the car with them. So we're really interested in this phenomenon. Why is it that having friends with you changes your decisions and changes your behavior, particularly if you're an adolescent? So I'm going to tell you a bit about our research on that now. So one of the first studies we did on this phenomenon was led by my former postdoc, Lisa Knoll, where we looked at social influence on risk perception. So we carried out this study in 563 participants, about half of whom were female, aged between 8 to 59 years. And this is a very simple experiment where participants are shown a scenario on a computer screen. So they've got a laptop and they're shown many, many different scenarios. You can see one here. This says crossing a street on a red light. Other scenarios were designed to carry a moderate amount of risk. So for example, driving without a seatbelt, or cycling without a helmet, or swimming in a lake at night. They saw many of these different scenarios, and after each one, they were asked to rate how risky they think this scenario is on using a computer mouse on an analog scale. You can see that on the screen. And then they were told, all the teenagers who've taken part in this experiment so far, this is their average risk rating for this same scenario. And in a different condition, they were told, this is the average risk rating of all the adults who've taken part in this experiment so far. In fact, this provided rating was not really the average risk rating of adults or teenagers. It was just randomly generated by the computer. But the participants believed that they were seeing real average ratings from other groups who've taken part. And then all that information went off the screen and they were asked to rate this same scenario again. And what we were interested in was the difference between participants rating 1 and rating 2 in the direction of the provided rating. That would be an indication of social influence, how much their risk ratings are influenced by other people's risk ratings. But what we were most interested in was whether people are more influenced by adults than by teenagers. That was our hypothesis, that if you're going to be socially influenced in terms of your risk perception, you're more likely to be influenced by adults' risk ratings than by teenagers. And that's the data I'm going to show you now. So in this graph, what you're going to see is the social influence effect in our 5 participant groups. That's what you can see down here on the x-axis. So these are children who took part in our experiment. This is their age range above the label, so 8 to 11 years, young adolescents, mid-adolescents, young adults, and adults. If the bar is below the 0 line, that means that they're more influenced by adults than by teenagers. That's what we hypothesized, and that's what we found for 3 different groups. So the children and the 2 adult groups were both more influenced in their risk ratings by the risk ratings of adults than by teenagers. Mid-adolescents were equally influenced by both adults and teenagers. And young adolescents aged 12 to 14, in contrast, showed the reverse effect. They were more influenced by teenagers than by adults. So what this result suggests is that young adolescents aged 12 to 14, their risk perception is influenced more by other teenagers, by people their own age, than by adults. And we replicated this effect in another completely separate independent study of 590 participants. So this seems like a pretty robust phenomenon whereby young adolescents are more influenced by people their own age than by adults. Now, we've thought about this phenomenon a lot and thought about what this the implications of this for everyday decision-making and behavior in adolescence. And one implication we think it has is that it might help shed light on why young people make the decisions they do. So as I said, we often worry about the decisions young people make. For example, questions I often get from parents and teachers are, why is it that young people, even though they're very well educated these days about the harmful effects of smoking, in this country, smoking is still quite prevalent amongst young people. Why do they do that? Why do they start smoking when they know that smoking is so dangerous? And this, what we're proposing is that one big motivation of young people, because they are so influenced by each other and because they are particularly concerned about being included by their social group and not excluded by their peers, is the avoidance of social risk. So a big motivating factor in adolescent decision-making is avoiding the social risk of being excluded by their peers. We've argued that avoiding this social risk might matter more to adolescents than avoiding other types of risk like health risks and legal risks. So for example, if you are a young person, a 13-year-old girl, and all your friends are smoking and they offer you a cigarette, what's more risky for you? Is it to say yes to a cigarette when you know the health risks and that you might get caught, or saying no and potentially risk being ostracized by your peer group for saying no? We would argue that social risk, the risk of being socially excluded, weighs in more heavily, matters more to teenagers than other types of risks. That's not to say that it's a good decision or that we somehow condone it for this reason, but it sheds adolescent decision-making in a different light if you consider that their social motivation, their motivation to be affiliated with their peer group and to be influenced by their peer group is paramount. Now, this also has implications for public health, because it means that when you're trying to encourage young people to make good, healthy decisions, for example, then maybe it's really worth considering having the young people themselves create the messaging and try to do the influencing of each other, rather than adults coming in and telling them what to do. And this has been found in a couple of different very large public health intervention studies. I'll tell you about one example. So this is a randomized peer-led anti-bullying intervention that was carried out in 56 middle schools. So middle schools in America contain young people aged 11 to about 15. This is by Betsy Palak and her colleagues a few years ago. So 56 middle schools in New Jersey were randomized to two arms. In half the schools, they carried out their anti-bullying social exclusion campaigns as usual, led by teachers. In the other half of the schools, the students themselves, a select group of students was chosen, and they were educated about the harmful effects of bullying and social exclusion. And then those students were incentivized to run their own campaigns, and they could run party campaigns, debates, poster campaigns, wristband campaigns. In the schools in which the anti-bullying campaigns were led by the students, student conflict and bullying incidents were reduced by about 25% over the ensuing year, compared to the schools in which the anti-bullying campaigns were led by the teachers. So what this suggests is that students leading campaigns has more influence on other students than when teachers lead campaigns. And the effect was strongest when the students who were leading the campaigns were the more highly connected students. So when they rated the connectedness amongst the social network in their year group, it was the students who were most highly connected who had the most influence. Now, This has also been shown for anti-smoking campaigns, that peer-led interventions have more power than adult-led interventions. So with my PhD student Jack Andrews and my former postdoc Lucy Folks, who's just written a book on mental health and works for Aeon magazine. We thought about this recently in the context of COVID, because, as you know, young people are taking a lot of the blame at the moment for the spread of COVID, particularly in America and around Europe. And we thought about, what are the best interventions going to be to try to encourage young people to take seriously social distancing and other social rules that are being implemented to try to mitigate the spread of COVID. And from the evidence, we argued that lecturing them about this, adults, politicians lecturing them and blaming them, is probably going to be counterproductive and won't have as much influence as if they created and ran their own campaigns to try to encourage each other to obey the rules. I mean, so far, this has absolutely had no influence on policy decisions, and they're still blaming young people for spreading COVID. So that's a bit of a shame, because we think that the evidence suggests that peer-led interventions really have potential. And it's all about, I think, empowering young people to understand the point and educating them about why it's important, and then letting them influence each other. Okay, so I've so far talked about peer influence on negative things and risky decisions, but it's not just negative, risky decisions where peers can influence each other. We've also found in a series of studies, I'm going to tell you about one, that pro-social influence is also heightened in adolescence. So I'll just tell you briefly about a study that was led by my postdoc, Gabe Cherchia. This is a study looking at pro-social influence on charity donations. He studied this in 220 participants, around half of whom are female, aged between 11 and 35 years. So this is a very, very similar paradigm to the one I just showed you in our social influence on risk perception. But in this case, we weren't showing scenarios of risk that carried some kind of moderate risk, but instead we were showing participants information about different charities. So we showed them many different charities in different domains, like climate change charities or animal charities or poverty charities, lots of different things. And we asked participants, we gave them a kind of endowment of money at the beginning of the experiment, and we asked them whether they'd like to donate any of their money to this particular charity. So they could use the mouse to indicate how much money they wanted to donate. And then we told them, okay, you donated this amount here, in this case it was 25, and all the teenagers who've taken part in this experiment so far, this is what they donated to the same charity. And then we asked them whether they want to change their donation. So it's a slightly different setup to our previous experiment. And they do this for many different charities. We manipulated, like in the previous experiment, we manipulated whether the purported donation, this was actually just randomly generated, was actually not randomly generated, it was computer generated. And we manipulated whether it was donated purportedly by teenagers or by adults. And we also manipulated, and this is really important because this is a new condition, whether the observed donations were higher than the participant's own donation, so more pro-social, or lower, so more selfish than the first donation. So in this case here, the apparent teenagers who've taken part so far in this experiment were being more pro-social than the participant. But we also had half the conditions in which we manipulated such that this provided donation was less than and more selfish than the participant's first donation. Okay, so I'm going to show you a couple of the results from this experiment. So first of all, what I'm going to show you in this graph is how the probability of being socially influenced. So what you see down here are the three age groups in our study: young adolescents, mid-adolescents, and adults. This is the condition in which the provided rating was lower than the participant's initial rating, so more selfish than the participant's initial rating. And this is the condition in which the provided rating was higher than, so more pro-social than the individual's initial rating. And what you can see, first of all, is that the young adolescents were more pro-socially influenced than the mid-adolescents or the adults. So they were more likely to give more money when they'd seen that other people had given more money. And this wasn't the case for the selfish donations. There was no significant difference here in the selfish donations. However, there was a difference in this condition, in that adults were more likely, this is the blue bar here, they were more likely to move their donation in a selfish direction when they saw that the provided donation was less than theirs, than to change their rating when they saw that the provided donation was more than theirs. In other words, adults show what is known as opportunistic conformity. That is the tendency to conform or be socially influenced when other people are behaving more selfishly than you initially are. This is a phenomenon that's been shown in other domains as well, and we are replicating it here. But what is interesting is that the adolescents, particularly the mid-adolescents, showed no tendency towards this selfish opportunistic conformity. And you can see that better in this next graph, which shows the change in donations for the three age groups, young and mid-adolescents and adults. This is their change in donation between donation 1 and donation 2. When the provided donation was more selfish than theirs, that's the pink bars here, and when the provided donation was more pro-social than theirs, that's the blue bar here. And what you can see, first of all, I think the main thing to focus on is how significantly different the change in donation is for the adults when the provided rating is more selfish than their initial rating. They really go in that direction. They decrease, and their second donation is massively decreased compared with their first donation when they see that others aren't donating much, compared with when they see that others are being more pro-social than them. Mid-adolescents showed no difference between the change in donations after a selfish and a pro-social donation, and young adolescents showed a small tendency to this selfish conformity. So I think what this suggests is that this tendency to be more selfish when you see other people being selfish is something that we developed as adults, and that isn't quite there yet in adolescence. So again, going back to these very negative stereotypes of adolescence, these data on the tendency to be more pro-socially influenced in adolescents go against this idea that adolescents are selfish and not kind. Okay, so I'm going to slightly change tack to look at social reward in adolescence. So sticking with this idea that adolescents are particularly place particular importance on friendships and peer affiliation, we wanted to know whether social reward is heightened in adolescence. Now, this has been looked at quite a lot in terms of the brain's reward system, but very few studies look at it behaviorally. So we wanted to do that, and we did that. This is a study that was led by my PhD student, Jack Andrews. We did that by adapting what's called an academic diligence task. I'll just quickly explain that task. Okay, so you might know this task. Academic diligence tasks are ask participants to do some kind of academic problem solving that's really boring and really easy. So in this case, it's really simple, boring maths like 8 + 8 or 4 - 2, really simple maths. Now, participants are motivated to do this by being told a cover story that doing these simple, boring maths sums is good for your brain and good for your learning and good for your neuroplasticity. So they think it's good for them, but they're also told that they can stop at any time and stop doing the maths and do something more interesting. In the original academic diligence tasks, they were able to go and play Tetris, a computer game, and they measured how much, the ratio of time participants spent persevering with the boring maths versus doing the fun Tetris. Now, we adapted that academic diligence task by keeping the maths, so that we gave them lots of boring maths problems that they could do for up to 10 minutes. But we told them at any point you can come out of the maths, you can just click this red button, come out of these boring maths sums and look at some really beautiful photographs. And the photographs were either non-social photographs of beautiful landscapes or social photographs of kind of aspirational people looking happy. And we measured the ratio of time participants spent doing the maths versus choosing to go out of the maths and to look at the photographs. So I'm going to show you what that looks like as the actual task. I think it's a bit easier to understand. We carried out this task on 91 participants. They were actually all female in this case, 45 adolescents and 46 adults. Okay, so in the social condition, you're told, right, you're going to do a bunch of maths problems like this. They're really boring. You can do as many as you like for up to 10 minutes, but at any point you can just click this red button to see pictures of people. So you might click that red button, you might do some maths, click that red button, and then look at these nice, positive, very rewarding photos of people having a nice time. And you can also switch back to maths whenever you like. And remember, they're motivated to do the maths by being told that it's good for them. So they might do a bit more maths. And then in the non-social condition, it's exactly the same thing. They do some maths, but they can switch to beautiful photographs of scenery like this. And again, we measure the ratio of time they spend persevering with the maths versus looking at the photographs in both the social versus the non-social condition. We also ask participants to give us an explicit rating of enjoyment. So we ask them how much, how enjoyable did you find the maths test? How enjoyable did you find the pictures for the social and the non-social pictures? And they just answer that. It's a very explicit self-report. So we have both the explicit self-report of how enjoyable or rewarding they find these pictures, and we also have the implicit measure of social reward by measuring the ratio of time they spend looking at the pictures versus doing the maths. So what I'm going to show you here is the explicit self-reported enjoyment for photographs. These are the adolescent participants and the adult participants. And this is how much they say they enjoyed looking at the photographs. So there was a kind of, a crossover interaction where adolescents rated social photographs as more enjoyable than the non-social photographs, which are in blue here, whereas adults rated the non-social photographs, the landscapes, as more enjoyable than the social photographs. And overall, adults rated the non-social photographs as more enjoyable than adolescents rated the non-social photographs. So that's pretty much what we're in line with what we expected, that adolescents are particularly prefer social compared with non-social stimuli. And in the next graph, I'm going to show you the more implicit measure of the percentage of time looking at the photographs instead of doing the maths. So here we found something vaguely similar, which is again, what you're looking at here is the percentage of time looking at photographs compared with doing maths in the adolescent group and in the adult group. And what you can see is that adults spent more time clicking out of doing maths to look at non-social photographs than compared with adolescents. So adults find these non-social photographs presumably more rewarding, which is why they're choosing to look at them more. And there's a marginally significant, our statistics were very conservative because we Bonferroni corrected everything. So Bonferroni uncorrected significant difference between the percentage of time that adolescents chose to look at social photographs compared with non-social photographs. So that does suggest, it's an indication that adolescents prefer or find particularly rewarding social stimuli, and they will be particularly distracted by social stimuli when they're supposed to be doing maths. Okay, in the last few minutes of this talk, I want to just switch to the brain. I'm not going to talk very much about the brain at all, but I just wanted to show you a big analysis that colleagues of mine and I have been doing over the last few years. So when I was an undergraduate many years ago, 25 years ago, I was taught that the brain stops developing in childhood. I know that because I remember my undergraduate lectures, and also because I kept my undergraduate textbooks, and that's exactly what they say. So only 25 years ago, the scientific dogma was that the human brain stops developing in childhood. Now that's because 25 years ago, we did not have the ability to scan the living human brain using MRI, and now we do, and many labs around the world have been doing that for the last 20 years, scanning the living human brain at all ages in order to track changes in both brain structure and brain function across the lifespan. And what those studies have shown, and there have been many replications of this in large-scale longitudinal studies, is that the human brain undergoes structural and functional development, not only throughout childhood, but also throughout adolescence and into early adulthood. And the changes are really substantial and protracted. I want to show you one example of that in the last study I'm going to talk about. So this is a study that looked at structural brain development in 4 different cohorts. So 4 groups, 4 samples of participants in 4 completely independent samples of participants in different countries. So this is a study that was led by Kate Mills. Kate was my PhD student a while ago, but she's now an assistant professor at Oregon. And Christian Tamnes is our long-standing collaborator. He's from Oslo. And there were many other people involved in this study. So in this study, they analysed data, Kate and Christian analysed data from of structural brain development, particularly grey matter development, in 4 different groups of participants from these 4 places: NIH in the USA, Pittsburgh in the USA, Leiden in the Netherlands, and Oslo in Norway. Altogether, there were 391 participants across these 4 different sites. These are totally independent studies that they just happen to be able to analyse together. And there are a total of 852 MRI scans. So I'm going to show you a couple of the main results, but there are many, as you can imagine. So first of all, this is cortical grey matter volume. So this is the average grey matter volume across the entire cortex. And what you can see here, it's plotted against age. So on the x-axis down here is age from 5 to 30 years. So what you can see here, I think one of the main things to notice is that these are lines of best fit from each of the 4 different cohorts. The cohorts are listed here. And the main thing to notice is how remarkably similar the developmental trajectories of grey matter volume are across these different cohorts, even though they're totally independent and living in different countries. And what you can see is that the line of best fit in each case except Pittsburgh, but the Pittsburgh sample had a narrower age range. The line of best fit in the other 3 cohorts was cubic. It is highest in late childhood, so grey matter is highest in late childhood, around 9 to 10 years, and then undergoes this very significant, substantial decline in grey matter volume right throughout the teens and into the early 20s before it stabilizes in the mid-20s. In fact, grey matter volume across the cortex decreases by about 1.5% each year during adolescence. So that's a really substantial and protracted decline in grey matter volume. At the very same time, there's an increase in white matter volume. So this is average white matter across the whole of the brain. And across each of the 4 cohorts, they show, again, a very similar trajectory. This is a significant linear increase in white matter from childhood, from mid-childhood to mid-20s, 30. So white matter increases white matter volume increases by about 1% each year during adolescence. There are many other results from this. It's the precise trajectories of grey matter volume, cortical thickness, surface area, and white matter volume depend on the particular brain region you're talking about. And you can have a look at that in the papers published from this, from these studies if you're interested in. But one question that we kind of end with, and which we're starting to become really interested in, and many people are around the world, is why does grey matter decrease and white matter increase during adolescence? The decrease in grey matter to some people might sound like a sort of bad thing, like neurodegeneration or neural atrophy. In fact, that's not what we think is going on. Now, MRI scans have given us a remarkable window into what is happening to the brain across the lifespan, but MRI currently doesn't have the resolution to tell us very much at all about the brain at the level of the cell or the synapse. So we can so far really make educated guesses based on animal studies and studies of post-mortem human brain tissue. And what those studies show is that there are various different really important neurodevelopmental processes that might underlie these changes in grey matter and white matter. And they are myelination and axonal growth. So as axons throughout development, starting very early on in gestation in humans, axons start to grow in diameter, and they also become myelinated. And those two processes in the human brain continue for many decades. And as axons grow and become myelinated, they'll appear more white under the microscope, and they're labeled as white matter. And so as white matter, as axons grow and become myelinated, that will result in an MRI scan as an increase in white matter and a concomitant decrease in grey matter. And that's because from about age 8 or 9, the human brain is pretty much adult size. It doesn't change very much in volume after about age 8 or 9. So as brain tissue becomes more white, there's a concomitant decrease in the amount of grey matter. And in addition to those two processes which are happening at the level of the axon, there's also a lot of change at the level of the synapse. So synapses, as you probably know, proliferate during development. So the brain overproduces synapses, connections between cells, so that in early development, the brain contains many more synapses than in adulthood. Due to this process called synaptogenesis. And after synaptogenesis has happened, resulting in a hugely excess number of synapses, those excess synapses need to be pruned away. And that's an interesting process because animal studies suggest that synaptic pruning depends partly on the environment that the animal is growing up in that synapses that are being used in a particular environment are the ones that remain and grow stronger. And synapses that are not being used are the connections that are eliminated, that are pruned away. Now, synapses, as you probably know, are mostly found in the grey matter of the brain. And so as we know that synaptic pruning in some regions like prefrontal cortex happens throughout adolescence and even into the 20s and 30s in the human brain. And so as synapses are being pruned away, arguably that will lead to us seeing a decrease in grey matter volume in MRI scans. Now, synapses are tiny, and actually that probably accounts for a very, very small amount of change in grey matter. However, what's really important about these processes is that they are neurodevelopmental mechanisms that promote neuroplasticity. That is, all of them are partly dependent on genes, but they're also partly dependent on the environment that the animal or the human is growing up in. So in that way, the environment might have an influence over how the brain develops. I want to show you one last slide, which is so far I have talked, my whole talk really has been about average brains, average teenage brains. But as I said right at the beginning, there's no such thing really as an average teenager, and individual differences vastly outweigh averages. And you can see that, and mostly though, as you know, we try to kind of eliminate variance in our data, either by including very homogeneous samples or by statistically removing variance. I showed you, for example, if I go back to this slide, I showed you these nice lines of best fit, and that's what you often see in developmental neuroimaging papers. What you don't see is this kind of thing, which is the raw data. That's exactly the same data, that's exactly the same graph, but here you don't only see the lines of best fit, you also see the raw data which these lines of best fit are modeled on. And what you can see here is that there are vast individual differences in brain development across childhood and adolescence, both in terms of intercept. There are some children, say, I don't know, 12-year-olds who have grey matter volume way up here, other 12-year-olds where grey matter volume is right down here, and also in slope of change. And what I mean by that is that for some young people, grey matter volume undergoes a very sharp, steep decline early in adolescence, and then it kind of levels out in later adolescence. And for other individuals, it's the other way around. There's not much change in grey matter volume in early adolescence, and then there's a steep change in later adolescence. And it's those individual differences which many people in my field are now becoming really interested in, because they probably hold quite a lot of information about, well, first of all, I mean, one question is why? What genetic and environmental factors contribute to individual differences in brain development? But also equally interesting is what are the consequences of those individual differences in brain development and behavioural development as well. So for example, going back to my original interest in mental health problems arising in adolescence, might it be that the trajectory in which your individual brain changes in terms of its for example, grey matter volume or white matter volume, contributes to or even underlies whether you will develop a mental health problem or not, or which mental health problem you might be particularly susceptible to. So that's what many of my colleagues are starting to look at now, trying to work more on understanding the individual differences in neurocognitive development. So just to summarize, social risk avoidance, avoiding the risk of being socially excluded, is an important determinant of adolescent typical behaviour. The brain develops throughout adolescence. I mean, I've only touched on that, but that is a huge area of research now, and there are just so many interesting findings coming out and so many questions yet to be answered. Individual differences, I think, are really key, and that's what people are starting to focus on. And finally, adolescence, because of these changes in the brain and the fact that they rely on or are caused by mechanisms of neuroplasticity, we now think of adolescence as a sensitive period of brain development. So childhood is, of course, a sensitive period of brain development, but the idea is it doesn't just stop in childhood. Neuroplasticity probably continues in a heightened way throughout adolescence as well. And that might confer both vulnerability to, for example, dangerous risk-taking and mental health problems, but also opportunity where learning and rehabilitation and intervention might have particularly profound effects. So thank you for listening, and I wanted to also thank my research group who've been involved with the studies I've been talking about today and my funding.